What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Thursday, January 9th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. 7-game NBA slate tonight. Pretty weird one. No real payoff options. I think Cade Cunningham and Trae Young are the highest projected players on the slate, most expensive guys. So interesting in that regard, a little bit different than we've had lately. And then also we are still waiting on plenty of injury news. Most of that coming in the early games, fortunately. Golden State, half of their roster is questionable. The other half is already out. So we could end up with a really, really messy Golden State team. Memphis, half of their team is questionable. So we could end up with the normal shit from Memphis where they just don't have anybody playing basketball that belongs in the NBA. But I'll touch on that stuff when I get to those games. Obviously, not a whole lot that you can do with that now. Memphis does start at 8. So that one is an hour after lock. You, if we don't have news, may want to, at least in case of tiebreaker, try and save some flexibility, some roster spots to be getting to whatever Memphis ends up doing. There is a chance they end up being not interesting at all if all those guys are in, but we'll see. I have them projected in for right now. But as always, going to go through game by game and just talk through each game from a DraftKings standpoint. We can take a look at what I'd be playing if the slate started right now, but obviously take that with a grain of salt. Things change between now and lock. With injury news, with ownership updates, with all of that stuff. So I'm going to talk through the DraftKings slate, starting with Golden State at Detroit. Like I said, Golden State, we know that Andrew Wiggins is out. Brandon Pajemski is out. Gary Payton is out. Jonathan Kuminga is out. Steph Curry is questionable. Draymond is questionable. Schroeder is questionable. And Moses Moody is questionable. So, I mean, this game's at 7. We'll have an answer by the time the slate starts. But for right now, absolutely no idea who is playing for this team other than, a bunch of scrubs that aren't on the injury report. If everybody is in, which is how I have it projected right now, then Trayce Jackson-Davis looks like the clear priority to me. I think he's going to look good one way or the other. There's nobody really on the injury report that affects him too much outside of Draymond, but I have Draymond projected in for 30 minutes. So, if Draymond's out, Jackson-Davis just looks better, if anything, because those minutes are even more solidified. But we know Jackson-Davis is a good point per minute guy. His playing time has been relatively consistent lately. You can never expect too much consistency when you're talking about a Steve Kerr team, but played huge minutes last game. That was a bit unexpected. Played 18 the game before that. But he's averaging 26 minutes per game over his last 10, 26.2 over his last 5. Have him projected for 29 minutes right now. Again, I didn't spend too much time caring about my Golden State projections right now because they're almost definitely going to change. But I think he looks really good at 5K. The matchup here against Detroit is nice as far as Detroit just playing bigs. Obviously, Jalen Duren does offer a very good rebounder. He, can protect the rim, but he's also not going to stretch the floor. He's not going to put Trayce Jackson-Davis in, uncomfortable spots in that regard. And then again, if Draymond Green is out, we already have Kuminga out. There's only so many ways Golden State could go small at that point anyway. So one way or the other, Jackson-Davis is going to look pretty good. Now, the ownership is really high, 47% projected ownership coming into him. That's a lot. It's a center position, so obviously the opportunity cost is going to be relatively high. As I mentioned before, no Embiid on this slate, no Jokic on this slate. You don't have the same level of opportunity cost at center as you do on some other slates. Also, when you just kind of look at the teams playing today, Phoenix right now isn't really operating with a center period, or at least one that matters for DFS. Detroit has Jalen Duren, but he's not somebody that generally you're really jamming in. It's not the highest opportunity cost center slate, but there are still plenty of good centers like there always are. So I do think you can probably find solid pivots to Jackson-Davis, but I also just think he's really underpriced here at 5K and certainly has a ton of upside. This isn't one of those 5K type plays where if you play him, you're hoping he gets 30 points and you're going to be holding your breath hoping he gets there. This is somebody that can legitimately go for 35, 40 points and put you in a really good spot. But that ownership is very high. And obviously there is a little bit more risk to his playing time if Draymond is in. Stephen Leibowitz just mentioned it in chat too. If Draymond is out, Kevon Looney is down to 3K. And Kevon Looney hasn't really been in the rotation much lately. But if Draymond's out, I would expect him to but to be getting the backup center minutes behind Jackson-Davis. Didn't play last game, played 16 minutes the game before that. But the more shorthanded this team is, the more likely it is that Kevon Looney is just getting backup center minutes. Like they don't have other bigs to go to. And then if these guys are out, you just have a situation where they're limited bodies. So this team, as guys get ruled out, you have Looney at 3K, Moody is 3,300. He's questionable himself. Buddy Hield, only 3,600, can certainly step into more playing time here. Not the best fantasy producer, but if you were in a situation where you already know Wiggins is out and then Curry is out, for example, you need Buddy Hield shooting in that case. Played 24 minutes last game, played 24 minutes 3 games ago with no Steph. Wiggins was in for that one. So was Schroeder. So was Draymond. At 3,600, as guys start getting ruled out, Buddy Hield, for example, is going to start to look better as well. Kyle Anderson, very cheap also. And he's somebody that, can play multiple positions, can handle the ball a little bit. So that's nice. 3,400, getting 13% ownership already. Have him in for 22 minutes. I didn't really get to him much at that projection, but he's still a decent point per dollar play at least. Have him at 20 fantasy points at 3,400. I think if this were a slate where you had Giannis's and Jokic's and guys like that to pay for, Anderson would look a lot better. But as is right now, not having those guys, if the questionable guys are in for Golden State, that 20-point projection at pretty high ownership isn't really that exciting. Whereas if those guys start getting ruled out and you start expecting, mid 20s or upper 20s in minutes from Kyle Anderson, then it starts to be more appealing. Not the best point per minute fantasy guy, but he can just kind of do everything. He gets you some defensive stats, can grab some rebounds, can facilitate a bit if Curry and Schroeder are out. We know that's something that they would drastically be missing. 451 minutes played this year, still 1 fantasy point per minute for Kyle Anderson. So his performance this year, not great from an NBA standpoint. Certainly hasn't impressed Steve Kerr. He's been in and out of the rotation, but from a fantasy standpoint, he's been perfectly fine. Moving over to the other side, because again, I don't really have a whole lot definitive to say here about Golden State other than one way or the other. Trayce Jackson-Davis is too cheap. On the Detroit side, we do have Ausar Thompson back. I projected him to start, projected him to play 25 minutes. I don't know if he'll start. If he comes off the bench, obviously I'll take minutes away from him. I'll add minutes to Beasley, assuming he's the one that starts in his place. But if he is starting, he is 4,600. He looks okay. He's getting 11% ownership right now. I only got to about 3%. I'm about even with the field on Cade Cunningham. $10,200 price tag, one of the most expensive guys on the slate. And so what that does is it just makes Cunningham look a little bit better relative to everything else. Because the problem, for example, last slate when Cunningham played, he was also projected for 23% ownership. I wasn't getting much of him. And the reason was that you had a really deep guard position where there were a lot of good guards in that like 8K, 8,500 range. But you also had guys to pay up for at that top tier that just aren't there today. So now you have Cunningham as one of the highest projected plays on the slate. And it's just going to make him look better because he's not going to be that difficult to get to. You still don't have Jaden Ivey here. I've mentioned it before, but you do get an uptick in playing time for Cunningham without Ivey in games that are competitive and where he's not in foul trouble. I have him projected for 37 minutes. He does typically play a little bit more without Ivey in those types of games. So I'm right around the field on him. I think he looks pretty good. Jalen Duren is interesting to me in tournaments. He is certainly somebody that you should be looking to in lineups where you're not playing Trayce Jackson-Davis. If you still need a high upside center in that price range, but you don't want the Jackson-Davis ownership in that lineup, Jalen Duren's a perfect guy to fill in there. He still has upside. He has volatile playing time, which keeps his salary in check. He gets in foul trouble relatively often. Detroit's involved in blowouts relatively often. So that keeps his playing time down, or his salary down rather. But in a game where it is competitive and he doesn't get in foul trouble, he can still give you 28, 29 minutes. He's a good point per minute guy. So I think that from an upside standpoint, at only 2% projected ownership, it makes sense. Somebody asked why Cunningham didn't play more last game. I don't know why he didn't play more in the first half. That game was a blowout. Nobody other than Malik Beasley that started that game played in the fourth quarter, and Beasley played some into the fourth quarter because he was already on the floor playing with the second unit. So Cunningham missed an entire fourth quarter rotation in that game. I'm not sure why. So I think it was just the unit on the floor in the second quarter was doing well. The Pistons went on a 12-0 run without Cunningham on the floor about halfway through the second quarter. So I think that probably contributed to him subbing back in later than usual and getting a little bit less playing time in the first half. He played 9 minutes in the first quarter. He started the second quarter, played 5 minutes, but then didn't play until there was a minute left in the first half. So I think he lost a few minutes there, and then he definitely lost a few minutes to the blowout. And then, again, it was a back-to-back as well for whatever that's worth. So I'm certainly not reading into that. Even if I couldn't find any reason, my assumption wouldn't be like, oh, shit, Cade Cunningham only plays, 32 minutes now. It would be, oh, something weird happened in that game. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't the norm. But either way, not concerned about that for this one. Like I said, I do like the upside for Duren. Nobody else here getting much ownership. Malik Beasley at 3%, Harris at 2%, Hardaway at 2%. Any of those guys are fine if they just land in a tournament lineup here or there, but nothing that I'm prioritizing. I do want to mention on Harris that Thompson being back is a negative for him. At least I would expect it to be. We have Fontecchio back now. He's been back for a couple of games. And then now you have Thompson back as well. So these games where you've been getting 34, 35, 36 minutes from Harris, I think it's likely that he drops back down into that 32-minute range, which coincides with his salary climbing up. So basically the inverse of why Tobias Harris has been a good play on recent slates, where his salary had finally fallen because he was only playing 28, 29 minutes. His salary dropped down into that 5K range. Then Asar Thompson is out and Harris becomes a really good play. Now the salary has jumped back to 6,300 in time for Asar Thompson to come back and Harris probably to lose a few minutes. So if you're playing him, it's because he's low owned and just hoping he shoots really well, runs into some extra rebounds, whatever it may be. But do be careful looking at his recent playing time and treating that as gospel, because now you do have Asar Thompson back in addition to Fontecchio being back. So Jaden Ivey's still out, obviously, but other than that, Pistons pretty much at full strength, which should be a negative on his minutes. Power said Bogdanovich picked up a Q tag. That really sucks. I don't know if I was getting to him, but I actually thought he was a really interesting play later. So now I also kind of assume he's not playing. But we'll talk about that one at that game. That does suck, though. Moving on to Toronto at Cleveland, where we have a 14.5-point spread, a terrible Toronto team taking on a great Cleveland team. No Donovan Mitchell tonight for the Cavs on the second half of the back-to-back. Everybody else is in, with the exception of Sam Merrill does have a Q tag for the Cavs. For the Raptors, Agbaji is out. Jamison Battle, Jonathan Mogbo, both out with the G League team. Davion Mitchell is probable. None of the pieces that matter have any sort of tag on this game. I think this one is difficult to project just because it is so likely that this game ends up being a blowout. But the other side to that is that Toronto is a team that is frequently involved in games where they are 12, 13, 14-point dogs. And so I do think it's kind of a mistake to knock their projections too much. And you kind of can see that too if you look at game flow charts for the Raptors. Scotty Barnes, for example, you can see on the screen, I projected him for 35 minutes. He averages 34 minutes per game for the season. Playing time's been a little bit higher now that he's fully healthy. But if you go back and look at a lot of games Toronto plays, Scotty Barnes ends up playing 35 minutes, and he subs out with 4 minutes to go because they're getting their asses kicked. So if you do what sites do sometimes, and they say, oh, this game has a 14-point spread, Scotty Barnes averages 35 minutes per game, we need to project him for 33 minutes, you're kind of double counting the fact that Toronto sucks and gets blown out a lot. Because if they didn't, Scotty Barnes would be averaging 37 or 38 minutes per game. So I am a little bit higher on Scotty Barnes' projection than some other places I've seen in the industry, just because Toronto gets blown out a lot. It happens. But if it didn't, he would play a lot more. So it's kind of double counting to just say, to project him even lower. Now, granted, Cleveland is a better team than pretty much anybody else. So it is more likely that they get blown out here than in most spots, but Mitchell is resting, which certainly makes them worse as well. So Scotty Barnes at 1% ownership, I think is pretty interesting. I don't have a lot of confidence here. Obviously Cleveland could just blow them out. Barnes could struggle in a tough matchup. But the other thing, in addition to the ownership and everything I just said from a playing time standpoint, his salary has dropped a little bit to 9,100, but he also benefits from the same thing that I was talking about with Cade Cunningham, where when you have a 9K plus Scotty Barnes on a lot of slates, it's really tough to get to him because you're going to have a lot of mid-range guys with high ceilings that are cheaper, and then you're going to have the highest projected guys on the slate that are, a couple $1,000s more expensive. But that doesn't exist on this slate. As far as, pay-up options go, you don't have the same level of competition for Barnes, and then he also has point guard and small forward eligibility. So I think that he's an interesting way to be contrarian in large field tournaments tonight. I think Jakob Poeltl is as well. He's still only 6,400. He's averaging 31 to 32 minutes per game. And it's the same type of thing that I was talking about with Barnes. If you actually look at Poeltl, like if you pull up yesterday's game where they lost by 14 points to the Knicks, Jakob Poeltl played 30.2 minutes. He subbed out with 4 minutes to go in the game. So if you project Poeltl for 30 or 31 minutes, you're accounting for the fact that it's relatively likely that he's not playing down to the final buzzer here. If he were, he'd probably be playing 33 or 34. So I don't really think that I'm that I'm high on Poeltl's minutes here necessarily. And the fact that he's not getting any ownership does make him look pretty interesting. You can say the same type of thing about Emmanuel Quickly at 6,700, RJ Barrett at 8,700, though I think Barrett is probably the most difficult to get to out of that group. Doesn't play quite as many minutes typically as Scotty Barnes. He's 2K more than Emmanuel Quickly. And we do also, Barrett's been a good producer overall this season, but you have to keep in mind that a lot of that fantasy production has been in games where Scotty Barnes was out. So Barrett's taking on a bigger playmaking role. Emmanuel Quickly was out, so he's taking on a bigger playmaking role in addition to being a scorer. Now you have Quickly, you have Barnes. You're not going to have to rely on Barrett as a playmaker as much, and that is going to cut into his fantasy production. So I do think that, you could certainly play some Quickly. I don't have him right now, but at 6,700, he does have a ceiling for sure. I think Barrett's the most difficult to get to out of the Poeltl, Quickly, Barnes, Barrett grouping. Grady Dick, 4,900. If you want to get to some of him, sure. Maybe he plays more because Agbaji is out. I basically projected Jacoby Walter to get an uptick in playing time off the bench with no Agbaji. I think Bruce Brown plays around 20 minutes. He's 3,300 if you wanted to roll the dice there. I just don't think you really need it on this type of slate since you don't have pay-up options. But I do think in particular Poeltl and Barnes are pretty interesting pieces to get to as long as that ownership stays really low. If you start getting them up to 8, 9, 10% owned, then I wouldn't really be all that interested. On the other side for Cleveland, don't know what the starting lineup's going to be here. I'm not really sure who starts in place of Donovan Mitchell. Last time he was out, Ty Jerome got the start, but Max Strus also was not in for that game. Neither was Sam Merrill. Sam Merrill is questionable tonight. He was questionable last night as well. He went through a full practice with contact on Tuesday. I'm guessing he plays tonight. I don't know. My guess for right now is that Max Strus moves into the starting lineup. I projected him for 28 minutes, which got me a lot of him because I don't think he's being projected as the starter in general in the industry right now. So this is just kind of one of those spots where it's up in the air. And what I have right now is going to change by lock because if Strus is actually starting at 3,800, he's going to be more than 13% owned. If he's coming off the bench at 3,800, he's still playable. He probably plays like 24 minutes or so in that situation, and at 13% is still a solid option. But that's why I have so much of him now is I'm just projecting him in a way that the industry isn't. But we're going to get the starting lineup, and if he's starting, the industry obviously will be projecting that correctly by lock. So just a bit of a discrepancy there, and that's why. Ty Jerome, if he's coming off the bench, I think probably plays around 20 minutes or so. He's getting 36% ownership. He's only 3,300. He's a good point per minute guy. I think that makes sense. Obviously, in individual lineups, you can make some pivots. Also, his ownership will end up being influenced by what happens with Golden State. If Golden State rules all of their guys out and Ty Jerome is coming off the bench, then obviously Ty Jerome is still a good value, but he's just not as good a value relative to everything else if you have a very shorthanded Golden State team. So that'll pull ownership down. Conversely, if he is starting, that ownership is going up because then you have a $3,300 Ty Jerome probably playing like 28 minutes or something like that. Overall this year, 1.18 DraftKings points per minute for Jerome. So one way or the other, he looks like a good value. Exactly how good is just going to be influenced by Golden State news, Memphis news that we may or may not have when this game starts, and then who exactly is starting for Cleveland, whether it is Ty Jerome or not. Evan Mobley getting 29% ownership at 8K. I think that looks pretty good. Basically the same thing that I was just saying about Toronto applies to the Cavs on the other side. You want to be careful. Like, obviously this game has blowout risk, but you still want to be careful double counting it too much because Cleveland's a double-digit favorite in a lot of games that they play. If they weren't, Evan Mobley would be averaging more than 30 minutes per game on the season. He played 35 minutes yesterday. It is a back-to-back. There is a pretty decent chance that maybe the Cavs go a little bit lighter than they normally would. But I went 30 minutes on my projection for Mobley. I'm getting 20%, Fields at 29%. No Donovan Mitchell, obviously opens up some usage for guys like Mobley and Darius Garland as well. Karis LeVert off the bench at 4,100, or assuming he's coming off the bench at 4,100. 23% projected ownership. I'm about half of that. But again, that has to do with Max Strus too. Like, it's all related. The more Max Strus looks like a great play because of how I have him projected versus ownership, the less I need somebody like Karis LeVert. Once all of that gets settled and we get a starting lineup, I assume that I'll probably be pretty close to the field on LeVert. I assume I'll be around the field on Strus one way or the other. Same for Ty Jerome. They all just look like solid plays here. Obviously, if Karis LeVert starts, you increase his playing time projection as well. Should see an uptick in usage for Darius Garland. Also, 20% projected ownership. I projected 30 minutes. 7,300 has a ceiling here. Good matchup against Toronto. Very bad defensive team. 1.39 DraftKings points per minute for Garland without Mitchell on the floor this year. 28% usage rate. 33.5% assist percentage. Happy to get to whatever Darius Garland I can get to as well. Jared Allen's getting 10% ownership at 6,400. Good spot for him too. He is relatively popular, but not getting a crazy amount of ownership. I went 28 minutes on him, which I think is really reasonable. If I get to Allen, great. I'm a little below the field right now, but the other spot here that I am kind of confused by, I projected 26 minutes for Dean Wade. Like, I assume he's going to start. That's a little bit more playing time than he's been getting lately, but you do have Donovan Mitchell out. So I think I might be a minute or two high compared to the industry right now, but I'm not that concerned about it. Played 26 minutes 3 games ago, 21 yesterday, 22 the game before that, 24 4 games ago, 25 5 games ago, averaging 23.5 minutes per game, both over his last 5 and his last 10. Maybe I cut this to like 25 minutes, but I would expect that he gets an extra minute or two with Mitchell being out. Getting no ownership at 3,700 just makes him look good. But again, that ownership wouldn't need to move too much for me to start wanting less Wade. Like, if that 3% ownership ends up being 9 or 10% by lock, then I probably end up closer in that like 15% range on Wade. It's just that 3% is like absurdly low for a $3,700 guy when people are going to play Ty Jerome, 12 times as often. Not that I think Ty Jerome is bad or anything, but just to kind of put that in context. So I think Wade is an interesting value. I probably don't actually end up with 30% by lock. Same goes for George Niang at 3,100. Like, these guys that just aren't projected for any ownership when we really don't know what the Cavs rotation is actually going to look like here. If Niang gets hot, he can play more minutes. If Wade gets hot, he can play more minutes. Like, there's a lot of volatility in these cheap guys. So I think the big takeaway here for me would just be that Ty Jerome, like, I agree, looks good. Max Strus, I agree with the field, looks good. But in large field tournaments, don't just completely sleep on Dean Wade or George Niang. These other cheap pieces in a good spot for Cleveland that could just get hot from 3. You run well on variance, but you get paid really well for getting lucky. Like, you're putting yourself in a position basically to make a lot of money if you get lucky. So there are a couple pieces here that you can use to do that. There are also pieces here that are going to be popular for good reason and look good in the spot against the Raptors. Des said, do I trust LeVert tonight? I never trust LeVert. One thing I will say about LeVert, assuming he comes off the bench, there's a tendency, I think, and I haven't, I'm not talking necessarily specifically about what I've seen today because I haven't seen huge minute projections on LeVert. There is a tendency, I think, for sites to project sixth men like LeVert a little bit better than they should when somebody like Mitchell is out in a game that has a big spread like this. Karis LeVert also has blowout risk along with guys like Allen, Mobley, and Garland, even though he comes off the bench, because what happens is a lot of times somebody like LeVert in a game like this, if it's competitive, LeVert is relatively likely to find his way into the closing lineup. And like Scott said, he can get 30 minutes easily in this game. I assume he's talking about LeVert. He can. If this game's competitive, like, you think about the closing lineup here for the Cavs, in a competitive game, the closing lineup is Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, Jared Allen, and then 2 of any of the other guys, basically depending on what the score is, what they need on the floor, who's playing well, who's hot from 3, all of that. Like, you can get Jerome in the closing lineup, you can get LeVert in there, you can get Wade in there, you can get Strus in there. Like, most likely it's probably some combination of like Strus, LeVert, Wade in the closing lineup, along with the 3 main guys. But that's just all going to vary based on how the game's going, who's playing well, etc. So he does have that sort of upside. But also, if the game is a blowout, he loses that closing ability. And what ends up happening is he subs in, let's say, 6, 7, 8 minutes into the third quarter, and then he gets pulled, like, if it's a bad blowout, 7, 8 minutes into or 3 or 4 minutes into the fourth quarter with 7 or 8 minutes to go. Or even if he gets pulled with 4 or 5 minutes to go, he loses out on that, the extra minutes that he would get potentially from Mitchell being out. So sixth men are really tricky in a situation like this because they do have a higher ceiling since there's more minutes available. Like, he's basically never closing when Garland and Mitchell are both healthy. Or at least it's a lot less likely. Like, obviously the three of them could close together, but it doesn't, the like median minutes doesn't actually increase necessarily by that much because in blowouts, he's still just in that like 22, 23 minute range. So they are tricky, but at 4,100, I guess to answer the question, no, I don't trust him, but he does look better with Mitchell out than he would if Mitchell were in. Mike said, how do you feel about a max 2 of Jerome, LeVert, Garland to leave flexibility? I don't love it, just because I really try not to set groups that include guys that share the floor, because you kind of end up arbitrarily cutting yourself out of some things that could work. Like, for example, like using this group because of the way that they're priced. Let's say this is a competitive game and you get 32 minutes from Darius Garland. If you get 32 minutes from Darius Garland, you probably want Darius Garland. Let's say it's a competitive game, Caris LeVert's in the closing lineup. You probably want $4,100 Caris LeVert if he's in the closing lineup. So let's say you want, in this hypothetical, you want Garland, you want LeVert, and if you're using your rule, you don't have Ty Jerome. Ty Jerome's only $3,300. There's a lot of instances, even if Ty Jerome's not in the closing lineup, because Garland and LeVert are, which you could probably maybe even get a closing lineup to all three of them, but that's beside the point. Even if we assume Jerome's not in the closing lineup, let's say he plays 18 or 20 minutes still, doesn't close, but he still gets to 20 minutes. There's a good chance he was the best sub $3,500 player. Again, obviously that depends. The likelihood of that depends on what happens with the Q tags on these other teams. But I generally don't want to set rules like that. Usually if I set rules, it's just guys that aren't going to play next to each other. Not that it's a good example here. There's not really any example from Cleveland because they all just play every position with the exception of Jared Allen. But for example, with like Detroit, Isaiah Stewart and Jalen Duren basically aren't going to play alongside each other, or at least they haven't this year. Stewart last year played the foursome, but those guys, like, every minute that Duren plays is one less minute that Stewart can play, and vice versa. But for Cleveland, they don't really have guys like that, with the exception of like Jared Allen and Tristan Thompson, and obviously you're not playing Tristan Thompson anyway. So I would try and shy away from that, just rules like that in general. But I do agree with your point about flexibility. Also, though, on this slate, like, the big question mark, well, one of the two big question mark games is at 7. So you'll have some answers there at least anyway. Moving on to Minnesota and Orlando, a game with a total like it is from the year 2000. 199 total in this game. Should be a good basketball game. Probably not going to be the best DFS game. Two good defensive teams, two slower paced teams. Not much ownership coming into the Minnesota side here. Anthony Edwards getting 6.5%. I got to 11%. He's 8,800. Very obviously has a high ceiling. No Jalen Suggs for Orlando, so that does take a good defender off the floor, but it's still a very good defensive team overall. You still have KCP out there as well as an individual guy. But Anthony Edwards, again, does benefit from the same thing I was talking about with Scotty Barnes and Cade Cunningham, where he's just closer to being the highest projected guy on the slate than he normally is, because the highest projected guy on the slate tonight is like 50 to 51 points, whereas normally it's approaching 60 or 60 plus if you have Wemby out there, if you have Giannis out there. So there's just a greater chance than usual that Anthony Edwards has the highest score on the slate tonight, and that does make him a little bit easier to get to, despite the tough matchup. Naz Reid, 4,700, does come with a nice ceiling given the potential playing time that he gets. But, again, you just have a lot of value on this slate, and a lot of it's kind of unnecessary too, since you don't have those 60-point projections to pay up for. You're probably just going to have so many guys from Golden State / Cleveland that look like good values that it just puts Naz Reid in that secondary, low-owned contrarian tournament option. DiVincenzo's been starting. He's 5K. McDaniel's 4,200, getting 2% ownership. Any of those guys are fine as contrarian plays, but they're just really, really difficult to build around in a game with a total this low on a slate where you have a lot of value and you just don't really need it. One thing that I do think is interesting, just how Minnesota's been playing lately, is that, and I'm not getting to him, Fields only getting 2%. Rudy Gobert's salary is down to $5,500, and we've seen Rudy Gobert play huge minutes again in the last couple of games. A couple of weeks ago, Rudy Gobert was frequently playing 36, 37, 38 minutes. Then we saw his minutes really drop off. Julius Randle started playing a lot more, and Naz Reid started playing a lot more. Then these last couple of games, 38 minutes 2 games ago for Gobert, 35 last game. Now you do have another matchup here against an Orlando team that has just traditional big centers that I think makes it a little bit more likely that Gobert does play big minutes. I projected him for 33.5. I still didn't get to him. His point per minute production has been down this year. Usage is down. Not that he's ever a high usage guy, but he's a very efficient player on his usage. So a drop in usage does still affect the fantasy points a lot. But I do think this is another matchup where Gobert is a little bit more likely to play a lot than a little. All that said, still not really getting to him. But 5,500, that's about as cheap as you're going to get for Rudy Gobert. Julius Randle is 7,400, has a ceiling as well. But again, just overall a pretty unappealing matchup against Orlando. Now going to the Orlando side, where they have the lowest team total on the slate by a pretty wide margin. Every team 103 or higher, give or take. But you do have some plays to get to here just because of this team still being shorthanded. Jalen Suggs being out, as I mentioned. Paolo Banchero is still out. He is expected back tomorrow against Milwaukee. Franz Wagner still out. Mo Wagner still out. So I am curious to see a starting lineup here. My expectation for right now is that it's just the same lineup we've been seeing, where Cole Anthony starts in place of Suggs, KCP, De Silva, Houston, and Goga start. You could get the Wendell Carter Jr. in place of Houston alongside Goga start. If that happens, it is good for Goga's minutes and it is good for Carter Jr.'s minutes. If they do that in this matchup, again, I don't know if they will, but I just wanted to mention it. We'll have that by 7 o'clock. Also, Jonathan Isaac, out of absolutely nowhere, played 25 minutes against the Knicks last game. Now, that is a matchup where Jonathan Isaac fits perfectly, and you expect him, you would want him to play a lot of minutes. I did not know Jonathan Isaac could play 25 minutes. His minutes had been just kind of living around 15, 16 in recent games. Then he just plays 25 out of the blue. Now you have a Minnesota team where if he can suddenly play minutes, you'd probably like him to when you're missing all of these guys. I projected him for 20 minutes here. It wasn't that long ago that he was playing, 18, 19, 20 minutes. I don't really know what to do with him. If he plays 15 minutes, I want none of him. But if he plays 20 minutes at 3% owned, I want a good amount of him. So, and obviously, playing 25 last game, 20 is not the ceiling. So I didn't really know what to do, but those minutes are clearly available for him if he can physically do it. So I went 20. Again, this is the front end of a back-to-back too, which I don't know how that impacts things for him. Maybe they just go balls to the wall, say, hey, go play 24 minutes tonight, take tomorrow off with Banchero back. We don't need you. I don't know. So I'm not really speculating on that aspect of it. But at 3,400, I do think it's somebody that is worth gambling on in your large field, top-heavy tournaments, just because, especially if, for example, let's say the guys for Golden State that are questionable end up playing. And so you have this 13% ownership going to Kyle Anderson in his 22 minutes, or you have 3% ownership going to Jonathan Isaac and his minutes that range anywhere from apparently 14 to 26. I'll take my chances on some Jonathan Isaac and, kind of just play him the same way the field's playing Kyle Anderson. If that doesn't work out, I can live with that. So I don't have any confidence in what Isaac's doing, but I do want to point out that he just played a crazy amount of minutes last game. And he's somebody that, if you were guaranteed he played 20 minutes here, he'd be 20% owned at 3,400. So it's a spot where I think just embracing volatility in large field tournaments where no matter what you do, you're most likely going to lose tonight because that's how they work. Somebody like Isaac becomes appealing there. Goga at 7K is difficult to get to, assuming that Carter is not starting. Again, the reason for that is Orlando has not been playing Carter alongside Goga. So that means you only have 48 minutes to split between Goga and Carter. Carter's a good enough player that he steals minutes just by playing well at times when he's on the floor. And he's just somebody that is very, very difficult to. It's difficult to project Carter for less than like a minimum of 18 to 20 minutes, which means it's difficult to project Goga for more than 28 or 29 minutes. And at 7K, it makes him difficult to get to. As I said, if you do get Wendell Carter replacing Caleb Houston in the starting lineup, Wendell Carter's projection then jumps to like 26, 27, 28, and Goga's jumps to like 31, 32, because obviously they're looking to play each other along. Looking to play them alongside each other in this spot. If Carter comes off the bench, I do still think there's a chance that you get a couple minutes of them alongside each other. But if he's coming off the bench, they're not signaling like, yes, we are doing that tonight. So it still becomes difficult to project enough minutes to want to get to much of a 7K Goga or to get to Wendell Carter Jr. But mostly, I didn't mention it, but the guy that I'm getting the most of, Cole Anthony, 5,800. This is assuming he stays in the starting lineup. He played 36 minutes last game. He played 28 the game before that. Didn't close. Lost several minutes to garbage time. A few games ago when Suggs got hurt during the game, Cole Anthony started the second half. He played like 18 minutes in the second half. So I went 32 minutes as the projection here. I went 27 minutes to Anthony Black. Anthony Black is the guy that can kind of just screw everything up here because he did return last game. He played 26 minutes. He was in the closing lineup. But because of how shorthanded Orlando is right now, Anthony Black was in the closing lineup over Caleb Houston. There's still, with Suggs being out and Banchero still being out, there's still a really good chance Cole Anthony is in the closing lineup, assuming he's playing relatively well, and that you get a closing lineup that is like Anthony, KCP, Anthony Black, one of the centers, and then either Jonathan Isaac or Caleb Houston or Tristan da Silva. It's not, once Banchero's back, then you really run the risk of like Anthony Black closing over Cole Anthony a lot more so than you are right now, where it still could happen, but they're just so shorthanded that even if Anthony Black closes, it's probably more likely to be in place of da Silva or Houston than it is Cole Anthony. Yeah, I can zoom in a little bit more. I'd already zoomed in some. I couldn't remember what setting I'd had it on yesterday. I think that should be better. So yeah, getting to Cole Anthony never feels good, especially when, one, he's Cole Anthony. He can get benched for just being terrible. But they do still need scoring here with Banchero out, and playing time looks good. The matchup itself obviously sucks. Portland taking on Dallas in Dallas. This game now starts at 7:30 because of bad weather in Dallas. It was originally an 8:30 start. Portland on the second half of a back-to-back. Robert Williams is questionable tonight. I don't think that's a really big deal because he hasn't been in the rotation other than yesterday when Klingon was out, but Klingon's back today. So I didn't project Williams for any minutes anyway. What we did see yesterday that I think is noteworthy, and maybe it had to do with a back-to-back, but I kind of thought it was going to happen sooner or later anyway, was that Delano Banton moved back into the rotation. That doesn't mean playing Delano Banton, but it does mean that you're trimming the minutes projections for the main pieces here. So Portland does still look fine across the board, but they don't look as good as when they were just running 8-man rotations with no Banton. So the result here is, I went 32 and a half minutes to Ayton. I'm getting a little bit over the field. He just looks good at 6K on a slate where you don't have, high upside or high expensive centers to pay for. So I still like Ayton here. He lost some minutes to garbage time yesterday, but still probably playing, 32 to 33 minutes. Shadon Sharp, 10% owned at 5,900. I'm right around the field there. I projected 35 and a half minutes instead of 36 and a half, which I think I did yesterday because of the rotations they ran. Avdia, I cut a minute or two off of him because his rotation for the second game in a row looked pretty shitty, but he's still a point per minute guy. He's 7,100, getting 2% ownership. He still has the potential to play 36 plus minutes. We saw him play 43 a couple games ago. That's not my expectation, but there is enough volatility there that at 2% owned, I'm somewhat interested, but clearly not a priority. Anthony Simons, 6,700, gives you a ceiling, 9% ownership. I got the 7%, getting a little bit of Kamara. Mostly just a team that I'm not building around, but individually they do have low-owned upside if you just want to grab one of these guys. Scoot Henderson played 29 minutes yesterday. His playing time's been volatile as well. He is 4,500, getting 2% ownership. I would throw him in that mix too of just if you want to grab a random Portland guy, fine. I do think Ayton looks the best of the group just because his salary actually dropped to 6K. Where you could really get screwed on DeAndre Ayton is if Portland goes to like a really ugly 3-man center rotation. They have Klingon in there and they have Williams in there. But what they're more likely to do, if Williams is in the rotation, is to play him alongside Klingon. And again, I think the most likely case is that Williams just doesn't play tonight, either because it's a back-to-back or because he hasn't been in the rotation other than yesterday anyway. So Portland, a secondary team for the most part. On the Dallas side, Daniel Gafford is questionable. I projected him out because when he got hurt 2 games ago, Jason Kidd said it was probably going to be a while. And then we're like 1 game later and he's questionable. I don't think it has a huge impact, but it does matter. So what we saw last game, first I'll touch on Derek Lively because I've been on a really good Derek Lively run lately, which has been nice. I played a ton of him at low ownership 2 games ago. He played really well, played 32 minutes. That was the game I think that Gafford got hurt mid-game. Played 32 minutes. Then last game, Gafford's out. Everybody plays Lively. I don't play Lively. He plays 19 minutes. You should take absolutely nothing away from last game's Derek Lively minutes other than if Derek Lively is in massive foul trouble, he will not play a lot of minutes, which I assume you could have figured out on your own. Do not look at last game and say they don't like Derek Lively. Derek Lively's not going to play a lot of minutes if the game's close and he's not in foul trouble. There is no takeaway from that game other than he was in massive foul trouble. So I have him projected for 28 minutes here. I think you could, if Gafford's out, make the case for more, but foul trouble is still something that exists. Blowouts do exist. I think, going too much more as a median projection is probably getting a little recklessly aggressive. But 28, I'm still comfortable with. It's how I had him projected a couple games ago, too. What we saw from a rotation standpoint last game, though, with Gafford out, was that Maxi Kleber was the direct backup to Derek Lively. Dwight Powell did not play at all, despite Lively being in foul trouble. Kleber ended up playing 29 minutes. Now, I think what happens if Lively's not in foul trouble is that Kleber's still the backup, but then they actually play some minutes alongside each other. So I went 28 minutes to Lively. I went 24 to Kleber. I still didn't give Powell any, but maybe he picks up like 6. I did have a few minutes left over here that I didn't really know what to do with them, so I gave them to Brandon Williams, but they could go to Powell just as easily. What we also saw, though, was 39 minutes for PJ Washington. Now, I obviously don't think he plays 39 minutes again, but I went 35. He's averaged 35 minutes per game in the games that he's played without Luka and Kyrie this year. And if you look at his recent games, too, you had a game where he was in foul trouble, barely played in the third quarter. I think that was 2 games ago on the 6th where he played 32 minutes. The game before that on the 3rd, he played 31 minutes. That was a blowout where he lost 4 or 5 minutes at the end. Assuming this game is relatively competitive, I think you're getting 35-plus minutes from PJ Washington if he can avoid foul trouble. So I do like getting him quite a bit at 6,900. I am over the field on him. Najee Marshall, I'm assuming he starts again, plays around 30 minutes. Getting 18% ownership. I'm at 10%. He looks fine. No real interesting thoughts on Najee Marshall. It just is what he is. Get to him a little bit. Looks like a secondary play. Dinwiddie at 6,500 played about 35 minutes last game after moving back into the starting lineup. He's averaged about 32 minutes per game or so as a starter without Doncic and Irving. Getting no ownership, I think he's kind of interesting, but I think it also just kind of speaks to it being difficult to really prioritize these kind of $6,500 like Dinwiddie, Anthony Simons type guys, where there's just a lot of them that look very similar to each other. But Dinwiddie, here and there in tournament lineups is fine, as is Clay, as is Grimes. But to me, PJ Washington's the priority from Dallas. I like getting to him quite a bit. He will look better if Gafford's out as well. So does Derek Lively. But again, I didn't really project these guys that differently with Gafford out. You could maybe make a case that like PJ Washington should be at 36 minutes and Lively should be at 29 if Gafford's out. But either way, I like both of those guys. I actually thought I might get to a little bit more Lively as like a Trace Jackson Davis pivot, but I didn't, at least for right now. But he is another one, like I was saying with Duren, where if Trace Jackson Davis is going to be like 50% owned and Derek Lively with or without Daniel Gafford is going to be 13% owned, you can absolutely just play some Lively in place of Jackson Davis in lineups where you need to save ownership. There's nothing wrong with that. They have similar ceilings, similar enough projections, all of that. Houston taking on Memphis in another game that is an absolute dumpster fire right now as far as talking about it. The Houston side is very straightforward. Chat said Curry and Green are in. Moody is out. So we avoided the situation where, let me just click back to Golden State for a second. So we avoided the situation where Golden State has like 8 bodies or whatever. That's good. Did we get a Schroeder update? Nothing on Schroeder, so that still matters from a playing time standpoint. But we avoided worst case scenario at least. Schroeder still matters a lot, especially for guys like Hield. Moody being out kind of just like helps solidify minutes for Kyle Anderson, for Buddy Hield to some extent. Lindy Waters is probably in the rotation now with Moody out. So yeah, nothing really changes, at least right now. The Schroeder piece still matters. For Houston, Tari Eason is doubtful. Jabari Smith is still out. Rest of the injury report is irrelevant. So we're once again getting a lot of Amen Thompson. 61% projected ownership at $7,100. I went to 38 minutes. He's averaged 37 minutes per game as a starter so far this season. He's played 41 in each of the last 2 games. Probably would have played 44 last game against Washington had it been competitive. But that was to the end. But that was also a game where Brooks was in some foul trouble. That's why you saw extra minutes for Aaron Holiday too. I went 38 minutes on Thompson. He looks good at 7,100. There is going to be a game sooner or later where he's the one in foul trouble and he plays 34 minutes or something. But he still looks very good, just given the playing time that he's getting and the fact that you do have like a 117 total here on Houston. You just you are going to start running into some lineups where you have to kind of decide like, okay, who am I cutting here? Where I have 50% owned Jackson Davis and I have 60% owned Amen Thompson and I have 35% owned Ty Jerome. There are just obviously going to be a lot of lower owned pivots around Amen Thompson because 7,100 is a price range where there are other high upside guys. But overall, clearly just one of the best plays on the slate. Beyond that, not a ton of ownership coming into Houston. 12% to Green, 12% to Şengün, 11% to Brooks, 7% to Van Vliet. All of these guys are fine. Jalen Green should play 34 minutes or so on average, but does have the potential to play more. Fred Van Vliet's been playing huge minutes. I have him in for 38. I'm still not getting a ton just because there are so many similarly projected guard plays. Dylan Brooks, same kind of thing. 34 minutes is where I went, but if he avoids foul trouble and also against Memphis avoids getting in a fight with somebody and getting ejected, which feels like an actual possibility, he can play 38. We've seen it, recently, but at 4,800, a decent price tag. So I basically think that everyone starting for Houston is fine, and Amen Thompson is a priority. So secondary plays for everybody else, relatively high upside, the potential for a lot of minutes, and then Amen Thompson looking like the clear guy that you want to get to the most. But the field's also playing him at a huge rate as well. Obviously, in large field tournaments, if something happens and Amen Thompson just sucks, whether it's from a playing time standpoint, injury, foul trouble, weird rotation, whatever, one of the easiest ways to move yourself toward the top of tournaments is just not have the 60% owned guy and him do poorly. But clearly projects as one of the best plays here, and I'm getting to a lot of him. John C. said Waters or Hield. I'll have to reproject for Moody being out. I assume the answer is still probably Hield, just because he is so cheap and he's in general ahead of Waters in the rotation. But yeah, probably Hield. Nothing else really standing out from Houston. Cam Whitmore at 3,800, I guess, falls into that category of like large field tournament, throw shit at the wall and hope to run good. But like he's the type of guy where I'd be more interested in the like $5 70,000 entry that we get sometimes, as opposed to the $15 or $18 20K entry. You generally don't have to go. You still have to, obviously have some high upside contrarian plays to win these, but it's just a little bit different approach than when it's 70,000 entries. Whitmore is somebody that if there's foul trouble to basically anybody ahead of him, he could get more minutes. But again, even last game, like Dylan Brooks got in foul trouble and Aaron Holiday got those minutes instead of Cam Whitmore. On the Memphis side, John Morant is questionable to return. Dennis Schroeder will play. So we mostly avoided Golden State being a mess, which is good. On the Memphis side, John Morant is questionable. He's been out with a shoulder injury. Jaren Jackson is questionable. Desmond Bane is questionable. And Santi Aldama, who's been out for a while, is questionable as well. If all of those guys are in, this team sucks from a DFS standpoint. Houston's a very, very good defensive team. And you've had so many guys out for Memphis that these prices have just gotten out of control. Jaren Jackson Jr., 9,600. If Desmond Bane and John Moran are out, by all means, get to some Jaren Jackson Jr. because he's like a 1.4, 1.5 fantasy point per minute guy without them on the floor. If Aldama's out too, then you're still looking at like 34 minutes from Jackson. But if Morant is back, if Bane is back, and if Aldama's back, you're losing playing time for Jackson because Aldama's back. You're losing usage because Bane and Morant are back, and he's priced at his probably highest price he's ever had. I don't know for sure, but I would guess. So, that becomes a problem. Bane at 8,100, kind of the same thing. Morant 9,100 with everyone in. This is a really basically impossible team, I think, to get to if everybody is in. And the thing is, like, you can look at it and say, oh, well, I'll just overpay to be contrarian. Like, nobody's going to pay 9,100 for John Morant. What if he goes for 50 or Jackson or whatever? We've already had so many guys that are like 3, 4, 5% owned that you can make that case for that are cheaper. Like, you have 5% owned Fred VanVleet at 7,200. You have the Raptors guys. Scotty Barnes is cheaper than Jaren Jackson at 1% owned. Quickly is what, $2,400 less than Morant at basically the same ownership for all intents and purposes. So you just already have like a pretty big kind of third tier of players that are just this big bucket of like, well, he's good, and what if he has a big game? That you don't even have to go like this far into the holy shit, their projection sucks for their salary range. So I'm sure, having said all of that, they'll all be in, and this game will go to like quadruple overtime, and you need Jaren Jackson to win or something. But I can feel pretty comfortable saying I don't think I'll have much, if any, Memphis if these guys are in. Obviously, as guys start getting ruled out, it changes everything. I don't have time to go into every single if then for Memphis, but we have seen a lot of it. In general, you've seen this team out, a lot of guys out for this team lately. Power said Gafford is in. So I will double back to that, since I had said that I projected him out. I didn't actually project Washington or Lively, and I mentioned this before, but I didn't really project them super aggressively for Gafford being out. Like, if Gafford were out, you could have made the case for 29, 30 minutes for Lively, 36, 37 for Washington. I hadn't gone there, so I don't think I'm going to end up cutting my projection for either of those guys. What it will change is that, like, I gave 6 minutes to Brandon Williams and 5 minutes to Prosper. Those will go away. I'll probably cut Kleba from like 24 minutes to, 22. Hardy probably goes from like 22 to 20. It's going to be more of like a trickle-down effect for other guys. So I did just want to mention that, because I don't, like, my reaction to that news isn't really like, oh shit, I guess I can't play Washington now, or I can't play Lively now. I think it's more just like, okay, well, I know where 18 minutes are going that I didn't really know where they were going before. So that doesn't really change a ton for me for Dallas. I still think if Lively avoids foul trouble, we've seen that he has stepped up as the guy for Dallas, even with Gafford in recent games. Again, just kind of harp on this Derek Lively point that I've been making for a few games. 30, it's the game where Gafford got hurt, but 32 minutes, Gafford played 8. 27 minutes, Gafford played 17. You had 20 minutes, and it was either a blowout or foul trouble game. Then you had a game Lively didn't play. But then before that, you were getting a lot of games where, barring foul trouble, injury, blowout, Lively's just playing 28-plus minutes, even with Gafford in. So I'm not really doing much to downgrade him or anything like that. Miami taking on Utah. Josh Richardson was upgraded to questionable earlier. That should not matter. There is a chance that he ends up in the rotation because Miami's trying to like showcase him for a trade. But he hasn't been in the rotation pretty much all season long. I didn't project him for minutes here. Miami is getting some ownership. Jaime Jaquez, 5,300, getting 20% ownership. I only got to 6, I think, just because there are some other pivots to get to. But he is somebody that maybe I get a little bit more of him. Just because, like, once ownership gets corrected elsewhere, for example, when I'm not playing 65% Max Strus, I have more need for Jaime Jaquez. But 20% ownership, like, I get it, assuming he's still in the starting lineup. He's probably playing 30 to 32 minutes. He looks fine. Bam Adebayo getting 15% ownership, $8,200 center. Playing time has been down a little bit lately. Really uninspiring rotations yesterday on the front end of the back-to-back. Only played like 30 minutes. Don't love the matchup here either, where you have Walker Kessler as a rim protector against a guy in Bam that is pretty reliant on scoring around the basket, but still no Jimmy Butler, still obviously a high upside player in general. I'm a little bit below the field, but I think he looks fine. Terry Rozier at 5K, he's averaging 32 minutes per game as a starter so far this season. No Jimmy Butler, of course, 12% ownership. I do like him as a value play. I think kind of what's happening here too is, you have 32% combined ownership to Jaquez and Rozier. I just kind of played Rozier more than Jaquez, where the field's playing Jaquez more than Rozier. I think that's a perfectly fine approach. I do think this is just a little bit too cheap of a price tag for Rozier. 9K for Hero, perfectly fine. Anthony Edwards type contrarian play. You're overpaying by a little bit for his projection, but no Jimmy Butler does mean more usage, the ball in his hands more. Overall, you do have a good matchup against Utah. I think Hero is a perfectly fine contrarian play. Same goes for Nikola Jovic. 4,700 playing time really can range from if Jovic played 16 minutes, you wouldn't be shocked. But we've also seen games where he's played 30. He closed both halves yesterday, ended up playing not yesterday against Golden State. So I misspoke about Bam on the back-to-back. He had a shortened rotation on the second half of the back-to-back last game. My point in saying that was I still think he's playing 33, 34 minutes. I'm not overly alarmed by his 30 minutes last game. But Jovic played 34 minutes against Golden State. That's a game that they won by 16, but it was competitive for most of the game. The same unit played basically the entire fourth quarter with Alec Burks, Duncan Robinson, Nikola Jovic, Rozier, and Adebayo. They went on a 25-8 run. It was on the back of the double overtime game, as Emil pointed out as well. So that was a game where I'm not reading too much into those rotations. Also, like I said, you had a very weird fourth quarter too. But my point here is you had a competitive game where Jovic closed both halves and played 34 minutes. I projected 26. I have no idea if this is the 32-minute game or the 18-minute game, kind of like I was saying with Jonathan Isaac, but he's 2% owned at 4,700. If you tell me this is the 32-minute Jovic game, he'd be 20% owned. If you tell me it's a 16-minute game, he'd obviously be 0% owned. So just kind of rolling the dice and hoping to get lucky here and there, make some sense in tournaments at no ownership. You can make the same case for Duncan Robinson as well. Des said, if Isaac plays 25 minutes again, I'm all in. Unfortunately, we won't know that until it happens or it doesn't happen. But that's basically the point that I'm making in why I'm playing Isaac and why I'm playing some Jovic. What ends up happening is whatever value guys have the safest projection, and I use that word very loosely, but whatever value guys you feel the most confident, they're projected for 22 minutes or 24 minutes, let's say 24 minutes, and you're really confident they play 22 to 26, those guys get all the ownership, whereas somebody that has a 24-minute median, but a low of 16 and a high of 32 gets no ownership because people are terrified, well, I'm going to play him and he's going to play 18. But you kind of have to just think about it in the context of no matter whatever lineup, whatever you think is the best possible lineup that you can play in tonight's tournament, the most likely outcome is it nets you $0. No matter how good it is, no matter what its expectation over 100,000 trials would be, it's most likely going to get you $0. So you shouldn't be afraid of playing a lineup that might get tanked because Jonathan Isaac plays 15 minutes. When the payoff for that lineup, the times that Jonathan Isaac plays 24 minutes or Nikola Jovic plays 32 minutes or whatever, is so high in a top-heavy tournament that rewards 100K to first out of 20,000 people. That's kind of how you have to think about this. It's not saying take crazy risks that nobody would ever see coming. But it means when you have somebody, if you have two guys that have a 24-minute median, one of them, the range is 16 to 32, and the other one, the range is 22 to 26, don't just always pick the guy 22 to 26, assuming that the field is going to choose him. If the field is going to play them at the same rate, then you always take the 22 to 26 guy because the field's just going to get burned a bunch and you're not. But assuming the field is going to say, okay, well, we're just all going to take the 22 to 26 guy, play some of the the 16 to 32 guy as well, because that volatility actually can help you make more money. Moving over to the Utah side, speaking of a team that is just kind of all over the place, We still do not have Keontae George. We do not have Jordan Clarkson. We do not have John Collins. We do not have Taylor Hendricks, obviously. We do not have Bryce Sensabaugh. Colin Sexton is available. Walker Kessler seems to just be locked in the 30 minutes here. If Utah gave a shit about winning, Walker Kessler would be playing 36 minutes in games that he's not in foul trouble, but that hasn't been happening. Drew Eubanks just played like 18 minutes behind him last game. I assume you're getting 30 minutes again from Kessler. He's getting 12% ownership. I didn't get to him at all. I would like to get to him at least some. I don't think, this isn't like I don't know what people are doing, so I don't have Walker Kessler stand or anything. I think Kessler's fine. He gives you block upside. He's probably playing around 30 minutes. This game has a relatively competitive spread. Maybe I probably end up with more of him by lock than I have right now. It could just be a function of some other guys that I'm getting to that maybe I have a little bit less of by lock. I think Kessler's another one of these just perfectly fine secondary type center options. Jared Allen, Walker Kessler, Jakob Poeltl, Bam Adebayo at a higher price point, Derek Lively. Any of these guys are just perfectly fine. Johnny Juzang, I assume starting, doesn't have to, but I assume starting, playing around 25 minutes. I have a little bit of him, nothing crazy. Sexton is the one that's getting the most ownership here at 25%. $6,700 price tag. I'm a little concerned about his minutes too, for basically the same reason as Kessler, where Utah doesn't care about winning these games. If they did, you would have seen, like last game, Sexton play a ton of minutes. He played like 30 to 31. So I haven't projected for 30 minutes. He looks fine at 6,700, but he's just getting a lot of ownership that I think I can kind of just reallocate to any of these other guards. There's been so many guards in this price range that we've mentioned that are just like 5 to 10% owned that it's just like, yeah, they look fine. I can just play kind of more of those guys, and it's going to cost me some Colin Sexton. But if Colin Sexton beats the entire field of $6,500 to $7,500 guards, so be it. Hopefully I happen to have a really good Colin Sexton lineup. It's kind of like a shittier version of Tyrese Maxey yesterday, where Tyrese Maxey was like clearly the best projected guy in his range, but there were so many other guys in his range that he still wasn't really a favorite, or at least a big favorite versus the field. It's kind of the same thing here with Sexton, where, yeah, he projects well for 6,700. He's going to have the ball a lot in his hands a lot. There's nobody that's really going to be taking it from him. It's obvious to see how he could have a good game. And I'm not saying he's not going to, but is he really that different than Anthony Simons, Fred VanVleet, Spencer Dinwiddie, Cole Anthony, who is getting some ownership, so not a great example, but guys like that, Emmanuel Quickley. I don't think when you take them collectively at no ownership, I think that's a spot where you can kind of just pivot to some of them, especially also if you are playing Amen Thompson, Trace Jackson Davis, Ty Jerome, guys like that. You run into the problem of like, okay, who am I pivoting off of? And I think Sexton kind of just has more pivots available than a lot of those guys. Lauri Markkanen, same kind of thing. 7,700, he looks fine. High usage guy. Doesn't have Clarkson out there. Doesn't have George out there. Doesn't have Collins out there. He should lead the team in usage rate. He played about 31 minutes last game. I projected him for 31. Maybe he plays a little bit more here. Certainly could. I don't have any issues with him. I'm just not getting quite as much as the field, but he does have a very high ceiling. I don't think there's a lot else to see from Utah. Collier probably starts again at 4,200. Not a great point per minute guy. Probably plays around 28 minutes. I didn't really get to him. Cody Williams played a lot of minutes last game. I projected him for more minutes than anybody else off the bench, but the problem is he's not a good point per minute guy. So I like gambling on the guys with volatile minutes that are good point per minute guys, where I just have to get lucky with the playing time and the rest should take care of itself. With somebody like Cody Williams, you have to get lucky with the playing time, and then you also have to get lucky with what he's doing, because usually it's a whole lot of nothing. But if you were going to roll the dice on like Filipowski, Potter, Mills, Williams, I think Williams would be the first one I go to, just because I do think he plays the most minutes probably, but I'm not getting to him. And then finally, Atlanta taking on Phoenix. Onyeka Okongwu is questionable, which does matter because Larry Nance is already out. If Okongwu is out, you're probably getting as many minutes as Clint Capella can play without collapsing, which might be like 28. But you are going to increase Clint Capella's minutes projection at $5,100 if Okongwu doesn't play this game. If Okongwu's in, you're expecting around 24 minutes for both of them. It makes them both look okay in tournaments, not priorities, but there is volatility for them. Like the median for them both is about 24, but you get games where Capella plays 28 and Okongwu plays 20. In the games where Capella plays 28, you want Capella. Similarly, you get games where Okongwu plays 28 and Capello plays 20. In those games, you want Okongwu. So there is that volatility that we're talking about that makes them somewhat interesting in tournaments. But as long as Okongwu is in, that the median projection for both of them is going to be pretty modest. Bogdanovic, I liked at 4,400. He kind of just came out of nowhere and played 28 minutes last game. So I projected him for 26 and a half. The problem, though, is that he got the midday downgrade. Whenever that happens, I assume the person's not going to play. When that happens to somebody with Bogdanovic's injury history, I really assume they're not going to play. So I'm going to end up projecting him out, probably, unless I have some thought between now and lock that I haven't thought of yet. And what that's going to do is just like give more minutes to Krejci, give more minutes to Matthews. Roddy gets into the rotation. It probably doesn't change a ton from a DFS standpoint, although Krejci is 3,300 and did start last game. If Bogdanovic is out, I think Krejci just plays more in general. So maybe I end up rolling the dice on some $3,300 Krejci. Maybe I roll the dice on some Garrison Matthews at 3,400. That could happen, but I'm not confident whether or not that happens or not. DeAndre Hunter's up to 6,700. That's really tough to get to. Trae Young, 10% ownership at 10,300. I don't know why he's getting half the ownership of Cade Cunningham. I like Cade Cunningham. I was playing Cade Cunningham too, but they're very, very similar. They project very similarly. I don't get this one. Also, if Bogdanovic is out, you could see increased playing time, an extra minute or two for Trae Young, because Bogdanovic/Krejci is his backup, and now Bogdanovic is out. So there are more of those minutes available. Keaton Wallace is out. Kobe Buffkin is out. So if Bogdanovic is out, that leaves Krejci as the backup point guard. So I wouldn't be surprised if you got like 38 minutes or something from Trae Young if Bogdanovic ends up not playing. So I think that's an interesting thing. Like, I like him anyway at a 36-minute projection. If I end up projecting Bogdanovic out, I'm going to like Trae Young even more because I'll probably end up getting to like 37, 38 minutes, somewhere in there. Risa Shea probably plays more without Bogdanovic as well. You don't have Jalen Johnson here either. Risa Shea is 4,300. Like, for him to not, I have him at 25 minutes right now. For him to not get to like 28, 29, 30 if Bogdanovic is out means that like Krejci's playing a lot, Matthews is playing a lot, and David Roddy is probably playing like, 16 or 18. I think there's a pretty good chance that Risa Shea just gets to like 28, 29. So Atlanta becomes a lot more interesting with Bogdanovic out. And then finally wrapping things up with Phoenix. Kevin Durant getting 35% ownership. I'm at 31%. 9,200 looks good. One of the highest projected guys on the slate. Pretty self-explanatory with Kevin Durant. Same goes for Devin Booker here at 9K. Should play a lot of minutes. Could also see, or probably does see, some increased usage, and this goes for Durant too. Just with the new starting lineup they're rolling out, like Mason Plumlee is a lower usage guy than Yusuf Nurkic. Ryan Dunn's a lower usage guy than Bradley Beal. You probably run into some efficiency issues, but the upside is really high, just given the usage that those two guys can get. Other than that, nobody is getting to anybody from Phoenix, and neither am I. Bradley Beal's still expensive enough. I can't really get there. Tyus Jones' playing time has been shit lately since the starting lineup change. I don't really see anything else for Phoenix, but Durant and Booker both look good. So that's all I have for you on this one. Really interesting slate. Keep an eye out for Memphis news, Cleveland starting lineup. Bogdanovic news matters. I think that's kind of all we're waiting on at this point. But yeah, good luck on this slate. Should be a pretty fun one. And I'll see you back here at the same time tomorrow. Thanks again for checking out the show.